And joining us now to discuss more about the upcoming NATO summit, we are now joined by VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. Good evening, Jessica. Thank you for joining us. Always great to connect with you. Jessica, what should we expect to happen this week?
Well, you mentioned at the top there the rolling out of additional sanctions that are coordinated. That's certainly one key thing that we expect to come out of this emergency summit. But we also heard from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg that there will be additional NATO troops pushed eastward. They will create 4 additional battle groups, and they will place them in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. So we expect more details to come out of the summit on that. And then, of course, breaking here in Washington, the United States has had several public officials, including the U.S. president, call Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal. And the State Department now is saying they will ask for an international investigation of the war crimes they believe Putin has incurred. So we probably will see some language around building some support for that. You mentioned reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas. That's expected to also be discussed. And of course, more help for those Ukrainian refugees. Some 3.5 million moved now just to Poland alone, and millions more scattered around Europe. Still unknown, though, will NATO make a decision on whether to transfer warplanes to Ukraine, as President Zelensky has asked for? Will they also consider transferring the missile defense system that's made in Russia called the S-400? Turkey currently has those. They could easily transfer those as a NATO member to Ukraine. Ukraine has an older version of that missile defense system called the S-300, both of them made in Russia. So presumably fairly easy to maintain as a result of already having them in their position. We don't know yet whether that will take place. But getting back to China, we heard John Bolton talk about what China is learning from this experience. And one thing that came up at the State Department briefing here in Washington today is that the U.S. expects to hold China accountable for spreading what it calls the disinformation that Putin and Moscow have been spreading with respect to biological weapons labs and chemical weapons in Ukraine. So we should be on the lookout for that to come out of the NATO Emergency Summit on Thursday as well.
All right. Now, Jessica, although there have been no indications of this happening as of yet, do you think President Joe Biden will be making a trip to the Ukraine in the near future?
You know, it's a question you have to ask because he's so close. And just because it's not on the schedule, as reporters like myself who've covered presidents in years past know, doesn't mean he won't go to Kyiv. But we do think it's fairly unlikely at this point. Again, it's not on his schedule. It's not unusual for American presidents to go to war zones. But in this particular case, there are no American troops on the ground in Ukraine. And therefore, there are also no logistics to support a presidential visit. So still unlikely, but, you know, sometimes they pull rabbits out of their hats in the White House. We'll have to see.
All right. So, Jessica, let's go back a little bit on China's position here. So what kind of message will this meeting send to China, especially with the upcoming EU-China summit on April the 1st?
Well, I mentioned the misinformation, and it's unclear exactly how the State Department or the White House would like to hold them accountable in that respect. But one thing is very clear. Here in Washington, they are very much of the opinion that if China were to join the sanctions against Russia, especially the oil sanctions and the banking sanctions, that they would be far more effective. And this runs counter to the message from China, which is that, hey, we do have this new diplomatic proximity, this relationship that we created and announced ahead of the Olympics, but we really don't have that much influence on what Moscow does. The White House would beg to differ. We can definitely expect that they try to convince the rest of NATO of that position and that we see potentially some language around that in the statement. Meantime, we also expect that Washington will caution all of the European members of NATO against really taking China's threat against their economies for granted. In other words, just because you have this regional threat in Russia does not mean you should overlook the long-term threat that China poses to your economies and to your military. So that also expected to be a message that we should look for coming out of this summit.
Right. Jessica, sanctions on Russia have impacted tourism also in Asia, especially here in Southeast Asia. For example, in Indonesia, many
Yeah.
Russian tourists are stranded without accessible funds. Can you elaborate more on how these sanctions are impacting Russians on a daily basis?
Well, you mentioned the stranding, but you also mentioned that Indonesia is preparing to open up the rest of its airways to additional foreign tourists outside of Bali. So there's a lot on the line here. Malaysia expected to open up its tourism on May 1st, or excuse me, April 1st. And Russians are having trouble traveling. The airlines are no longer flying. In many cases, their banks are shut down, so they can't get cash or access to cash when they travel. And there are also higher prices expected for regional airlines. So the biggest impact, not just on Indonesia and that piece of Bali, but also on Thailand and Vietnam. They get a lot of revenue from tourism, and particularly for Russian tourists. They were expecting 1.8 million Russians to visit this year. That number now expected to be way off. Phuket Tourist Association actually said that Russian tourists have dropped their visits to Thailand by 80% in the last 3 weeks. So if that is any indication, Southeast Asia should not be counting on that revenue this year.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that report. That was Jessica Stone from VOA. Thank you, Jessica. Have a nice day.
You bet.